Why did the Boeing 787 Dreamliner's safety systems fail? The answers lie in terabytes of digital clues now.
What really brought down Air India Flight 171 in a story that's sending shockwaves through the aviation world. Investigators have finally decoded the black box, and according to reports, it's far worse than we imagined. Even David Muir hinted at the global implications during a recent segment. But what's inside those final seconds of cockpit data is something no one was prepared to hear. This wasn't just a crash. This was something deeper, something that may have been missed or worse, ignored. In this video, we uncover the disturbing new claims, the hidden warnings, and why this investigation is far from over. A routine flight that never returned. June 12, 2025. On the morning of the 12th of June, Air India Flight AI-171 crashed. Air India Flight 171 pushed back from the gate in Ahmedabad like any other day. A Boeing 787 Dreamliner, fully fueled, fully loaded, clear for takeoff to London Gatwick. No weather delays, no technical faults reported. Nothing unusual except that 30 seconds later, the plane was gone. What happened in those 30 seconds has since become one of the most disturbing mysteries in Indian aviation history. The aircraft lifted off the runway just after 1:38 p.m. local time, and almost immediately, something was off. People on the ground noticed it first. Not just a sudden loss of altitude, but a strange grinding noise. One student near the BJ Medical College campus even filmed it, unknowingly capturing the final moments of the flight. The plane crashed into a student hostel. It didn't just hit the building, it tore straight through it. 19 people on the ground were killed. Medical students were killed and several others injured after an Air India flight crashed into the BJ Medical College campus in Ahmedabad today. Dozens more were injured, but that was only part of the devastation. On board were 230 passengers and 12 crew members. Only one survived. His name was Vishwas Romesh, a 29-year-old British citizen seated in 11A. My seat is broken. Then I see the pace a little bit, and I will try to come out. Somehow, he was thrown clear of the cabin wreckage through a break near the forward galley. He was found screaming for help, burned, bleeding, and confused, still calling for his younger brother, who had been seated next to him. That brother never made it out. Within hours, recovery teams had located both black boxes. The flight data recorder and the cockpit voice recorder were found intact, despite the chaos. That's rare. In most crashes, there's always a risk the memory gets damaged. But this time, both units were quickly secured and flown to New Delhi. And then nothing for days, silence. The investigation kicked off fast. Multiple agencies were involved. India's AIB led the probe supported by the US NTSB, the UK's AIB, Boeing, and G Aerospace. And that last one, G, raised eyebrows. The engines on Flight 171 were GX-1Bs, modern, efficient, and rarely problematic. Yet, here they were, suddenly under scrutiny. It didn't take long before rumors started spreading. Was it a software issue? A manufacturing defect? Sabotage? Officials wouldn't confirm anything. The Minister of Civil Aviation kept repeating the same line. Every scenario is being investigated. But behind closed doors, there were whispers that the engines failed almost simultaneously, that the autopilot behaved erratically, that the pilots tried to override the system and couldn't. One leaked comment from inside the investigation said it was like the plane stopped listening. Meanwhile, Air India quietly grounded similar aircraft for inspection. Not permanently, just long enough to check something. And still no official statement. No early readout. No preliminary transcript from the cockpit audio. Nothing that explained how a jetliner could fall out of the sky seconds after takeoff. For the families of the victims, it was unbearable. Many of them gathered near the crash site or waited outside the investigation office, hoping for answers, holding photos, lighting candles, asking questions no one seemed willing to answer. Emotional. You want our person immediately. Immediately. Where's my daddy? Where is my mother? Where is my children? All they knew was that something went very wrong. That the crash hadn't been caused by weather or a bird strike or pilot error. It had all the signs of something deeper, something systemic, something that should have been caught. And now, as investigators dig through the data, try and make sense of those final seconds, that feeling lingers, a feeling that the worst part isn't just what happened in the air, but what might have been missed on the ground long before the wheels ever left the runway. The search for answers begins. By the next morning, the crash site was sealed off with blue tarps and barricades. Forensics teams combed through twisted wreckage, while firefighters doused smoldering pieces of fuselage. The stench of burned fuel hung in the air. Locals who had rushed in with blankets and buckets were now being kept back. What they'd seen, what many filmed, was already spreading online. A Dreamliner, one of the most advanced jets in commercial service, nosediving into a residential block less than a minute after takeoff. Everyone wanted answers. No one had them. The black boxes became the key. Both were recovered within hours. The flight data recorder was found wedged between concrete and steel inside what used to be the second floor. The cockpit voice recorder was discovered on the hostel rooftop, surprisingly intact. Investigators said that alone was a miracle. Normally, crashes like this leave data corrupted or completely lost. But this time both recorders had survived, and they were immediately flown to the Aircraft Accident Investigation Bureau in New Delhi. There was hope. People assumed that once the boxes were downloaded, a timeline would be released, maybe even a cockpit transcript. That's how it usually goes. But this time, things moved slower, much slower. On June 24th, nearly 2 weeks after the crash, the AIB confirmed they had extracted the memory modules and were beginning analysis, but no information was shared beyond that. Not a single snippet of data, not a waveform chart, not even confirmation of how long the recordings lasted. The silence wasn't just frustrating, it was alarming. In the meantime, international agencies started arriving. The US NTSB, the UK AIB, technical experts from Boeing, and engine specialists from GE Aerospace. That raised flags. Some saw it as a routine move, others didn't. Why would GE be involved unless the engines were under serious suspicion? Around this time, small leaks started surfacing. Nothing concrete, but enough to spark speculation. Someone inside the probe reportedly said both engines had rolled back almost simultaneously. Another source hinted that the aircraft's thrust settings had spiked and dropped unnaturally. A few mentioned issues with the flight control system, even with the auto throttle, but without official confirmation. These details lived in a gray zone, too specific to ignore, but too vague to trust. Then came the inspections. Quietly, without public fanfare, India grounded several Dreamliners in its fleet for what it called a routine system sweep. Most of them were cleared within days. But the message was clear. Something was being checked. Something they weren't ready to talk about. Back in Ahmedabad, families were still waiting for answers. Grief had settled into something heavier. Suspicion. Why hadn't anything been released? Why did officials keep dodging direct questions? Why did it feel like no one wanted to say what really went wrong? One reporter finally asked a question out loud during a press conference. Is this being treated as a technical malfunction or something else? The minister didn't flinch. He gave a neutral response. All possibilities are being evaluated, including sabotage. That single word, sabotage, changed the tone of everything. People had already been theorizing about mechanical issues, software bugs, maybe even procedural failure. But that word opened a different door, one that involved intention, one that suggested someone might have done something. From that point on, the investigation entered unfamiliar territory. The focus wasn't just on how the crash happened, but whether someone knew it could, and if they did, why nothing was done to stop it. The black boxes held the answer. Everyone knew that. But until those recordings were decoded, until someone stood at a podium and told the public what really happened in that cockpit, the crash of Flight 171 would remain a story of silence. And behind that silence, something no one was ready to admit. Theories, leaks, and warnings ignored. Weeks passed, but the silence surrounding Flight 171 didn't break. Not in any official capacity. The investigation was moving, yes, but only behind locked doors and vague press statements. Publicly, there were no answers, no details about the pilot's final words, no confirmation of what exactly the black boxes revealed. But quietly, Through side channels, rumors started leaking out. Not wild conspiracy theories, but technical whispers, specific, repeated, and hard to ignore. The first persistent claim that both engines had throttled back at nearly the same moment. Not gradually, not as part of a normal climb, but abruptly, as if something told them to reduce power. Normally, dual-engine failure is extremely rare, almost unheard of on modern aircraft, especially without warning. But this wasn't just a power drop. According to one anonymous source, the flight data showed something worse, a moment where both engines were responding to faulty input and then silence. That's when attention turned to the engines themselves. The GNX-1B series built by General Electric had a strong safety record, but they were also deeply complex, fully digital, controlled by FADEC systems, full authority digital engine control. Basically, a software brain that manages engine performance. If that brain gets confused, the engines can do things pilots don't expect, or worse, things they can't stop. Some began to wonder, had this happened before? Digging into past reports revealed a few worrying patterns. In 2019, a 787 experienced an uncommanded thrust reduction after takeoff. It was traced back to a sensor anomaly misread by the FADEC. Pilots recovered. No one died, but the software patch issued after that incident raised eyebrows because it was reportedly never mandatory. Operators were advised, not ordered, to update. And now, whispers started suggesting that Flight 171 may have been flying with an older version of that same software. Then came another leak, even more unsettling, a maintenance entry 2 days before the crash. A technician had reportedly flagged a momentary idle spike during engine run-up tests. No further action recorded. The aircraft remained in service. If true, it meant someone saw something odd and nothing was done. Boeing and GE refused to comment. Air India called the report unverified, but by now, it was too late to stop the speculation. Every delay, every half-answer added fuel to the fire. Flight crews began talking behind closed doors. WhatsApp groups filled with screenshots of old engine advisories and PDF manuals. Pilots asked each other if they'd ever experienced weird throttle behavior on takeoff. A few said yes. None had reported it. Why would they? The plane leveled off. Passengers got their meals. Everything looked fine until now, and then buried deep in an aviation forum came another detail. An anonymous post claiming that early reads from the CVR included confusion in the cockpit, not panic, not screaming, but lines like, "Why isn't it climbing?" and "Manual's not responding." If those quotes were real, and that's still unconfirmed, it pointed to something chilling. Not just an engine failure, not just bad software, but a moment when the pilots couldn't override the system. They were locked out. At least that's what the whispers said. No official report has confirmed it. No press conference has backed it up. But the pieces, even if unofficial, are starting to line up. A flagged anomaly before the crash. A possible software glitch ignored. A sudden dual-engine rollback. And a cockpit that may have been trying in vain to fight back. It's no longer just about what went wrong. It's about who knew something might, and whether they did enough to stop it. Black box decoded. The breakthrough came quietly. No flashing headlines, no live stream press conference, just a series of leaks, expert whispers, and buried statements from officials who clearly weren't ready to face the full weight of what had been found. But by late June, one thing became clear. Researchers had finally decoded the black box from Air India Flight 171. And according to multiple internal reports, what they discovered was far worse than anyone imagined. The cockpit voice recorder, often the most haunting part of any investigation, reportedly captured something deeply unsettling. There was no mechanical failure warning, no cries of distress, no explosion, just confusion, rapid-fire button presses, manual overrides, and a final moment where one of the pilots muttered, "We've lost both." Seconds later came a clipped, broken phrase that some believe was, "We have no control. The data ends just before impact." According to sources close to the investigation, the flight data recorder revealed that both engines entered what's being described as an uncommanded idle state, a near-complete loss of thrust at the same time, right after takeoff. This would have immediately triggered a stall. But here's where it gets stranger. Investigators say the thrust levers were manually pushed forward twice, yet the engines didn't respond. Not because they were broken, but because the FAC system, the software brain that controls the engines, overrode the pilot input. If that sounds impossible, that's the problem. It shouldn't be. Reports suggest the system falsely believed the aircraft was still on the ground, sending the engines into idle and ignoring climb commands. This glitch, referred to in some internal documents as a ground mode lockout, has allegedly been discussed in technical circles for years, but critically it was never flagged as an emergency risk scenario. And that brings us to the part that investigators reportedly called the most disturbing. There was a maintenance entry log 2 days before the crash, something minor, an idle fluctuation during startup, not unusual. But according to a confidential source, a technician did flag it for review. The aircraft flew anyway. Whether that note was read, ignored, or cleared under pressure to keep the schedule on track remains unanswered. But if true, this is shocking. Not just because the warning was there, but because it may have been the only one they'd ever get. Some insiders now believe that the CVR and FDR data suggest the pilots were locked out of their own engines, not due to sabotage, not due to human error, but because of a system behaving exactly as programmed, just under the wrong conditions. And that raises uncomfortable questions. If the system misinterpreted altitude, if it prioritized a flawed sensor input, if it refused to return control to the pilots in a critical moment, then who is responsible? The software engineers, the airline for not updating the patch, the regulators who didn't make it mandatory. Boeing has remained silent. General Electric has issued no direct response. The AIB has refused to confirm or deny any of the leaked findings, but we're still left with shadow of doubt. The full report isn't public. The data hasn't been independently reviewed. The cockpit transcript hasn't been released. So much of this is coming from inside sources, carefully chosen words, and unofficial summaries. And that might be the most terrifying part. If what's being reported is even half true, then this crash wasn't just a tragedy. It was a warning that may have been ignored until it was too late, and possibly one that's still not being fully acknowledged. Could this happen again? That's the question now sitting at the center of everything. Not just what happened on Flight 171, but whether it could happen again. And based on the patterns we're starting to see, the answer isn't exactly comforting, because this wasn't a fluke, not in the traditional sense. According to multiple reports, what brought down that Dreamliner wasn't a catastrophic explosion or bird strike, or even a pilot error. It may have been a chain of automated decisions triggered by a known software behavior. And that means this wasn't random. It was possible, predictable, maybe even preventable. After the leaks began to circulate about the FADEX system possibly locking out pilot input, other flight crews started to speak. Up quietly at first, in private forums and off-the-record conversations, several reported strange throttle behavior during takeoff on similar aircraft, especially under specific conditions. One pilot said that months before the crash, he noticed an unusual pause in engine response right after rotation, lasting only seconds. He chalked it up to environmental factors. The flight continued without incident, but now he's not so sure. And here's where it gets worse. These isolated incidents, most of which were never formally reported, line up with what the black box from Flight 171 allegedly revealed. According to people close to the investigation, the engines dropped to idle because the software believed the aircraft hadn't left the ground. That alone sounds absurd, but the FADEX system relies on multiple sensors. And if even one feeds incorrect data, the system can make choices that look logical on paper and disastrous in the real world. That's not a theory. That's how these systems work. In some cases, the pilot's manual input is only a suggestion, subject to override by automation, designed to protect the engines or prioritize fuel flow, even at the cost of responsiveness. It's the double-edged sword of modern aviation. Automation prevents 99 out of 100 problems. But if the problem is the automation itself, that 1% becomes lethal. This has sparked renewed scrutiny across the airline industry. Regulators in several countries have reportedly begun reevaluating how software updates are classified. Right now, most engine-related patches are considered recommended, not mandatory. That means airlines can choose when, or even whether to install them. And in a world of tight schedules and cost-saving pressures, those decisions sometimes fall through the cracks. After Flight 171, Air India quietly grounded several of its 787s for inspections. Other carriers followed suit, not officially, not with headlines, but through backdoor memos and hush-hush maintenance sweeps. Technicians were told to check for any signs of idle anomalies. Software versions were reviewed, but still no one stepped forward to say, yes, this was the cause. No one publicly took responsibility. Boeing, meanwhile, continues to face criticism for its silence. GE Aerospace has offered technical assistance to investigators, but has not made any public comment about the engine's software under review. And with no official interim report released, everything stays in limbo. A confirmed pattern that hasn't been confirmed, a fix that hasn't been ordered. And so the question lingers, could this happen again? The truth is, maybe it already has. Maybe we just haven't heard about it yet, because the previous crews managed to recover in time. Maybe their flights didn't crash, so their stories were dismissed. Maybe Flight 171 wasn't the beginning of a new problem, but the first time an old one wasn't survivable. Until someone steps up and explains exactly what happened, what was known, and what changes are being made, the threat doesn't go away. It just disappears back into clouds, waiting for another aircraft, another climb, another 30 seconds at decide everything. A wound that won't heal. Weeks have passed, and the official report is still under lock and key. Families wait. The media speculates. Investigators continue their work behind closed doors. But the silence is starting to feel like a verdict in itself. Everyone knows something is wrong, yet no one will say it plainly. Flight 171 is no longer just a crash. It's become a symbol of broken systems, missed warnings, and questions that refuse to go away. The memorial outside BJ Medical College has grown. What began as a few flowers and photographs has turned into a wall of grief. Notes from children, photos of young couples, airline tags still stained with ash. People still visit, some light candles, some just stand there staring. A few speak to the pictures as if they're listening. One woman, whose daughter died on board, leaves the same note every week. Tell me why. No one has. The survivor, Vishwas Romesh, hasn't spoken publicly since the hospital released him. He declined interviews. His family says he's still recovering both physically and emotionally. One report claimed he keeps waking up screaming from dreams of being trapped inside a burning fuselage. Another said he now checks the engines on every plane before boarding, even though he knows it won't change anything. He was in seat 11A. Everyone remembers that now, the miracle seat, the seat that lived, and still, the system around him stays quiet. There's talk that the full cockpit transcript may never be released, that certain parts are too sensitive or too damaging. Some suggest the engineers responsible for the software oversight were already reassigned months before the crash. Others claim a legal wall is forming, a silent preparation for lawsuits the industry knows are coming. Air India has offered condolences. Boeing has expressed sympathy. GE has promised cooperation. But none of them have offered what people really want, answers. This isn't just about technical findings anymore. It's about trust. Trust in aviation. Trust in the people who certify these systems, who maintain them, who choose what counts as a mandatory update and what doesn't. Flight 171 has left a scar across every part of that process. And the longer the silence goes on, the deeper that scar becomes. There's a feeling now, hard to shake, that this was an unavoidable tragedy. That the clues were there, scattered across old reports, minor maintenance flags, overlooked advisories. Nothing loud enough to sound the alarm, but together enough to form a picture. And no one put it together in time. Maybe they still won't. The investigation continues, and the full truth may eventually be forced into daylight. But even then, it won't change what's already happened. The names on that passenger list won't come back. The families won't stop wondering. And every time another Dreamliner lifts off the runway, there will be people watching, holding their breath, and asking themselves the same question. Has anything really changed? Because wounds like this don't close with silence. And they definitely don't heal on their own. Should pilots have the final authority to override all automated systems during flight? no matter the risk,